This is the Biblical Unitarian Podcast.
Hello, and welcome again to the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, the podcast that aims to start conversations about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. My name is Dustin Smith, and as always, I will be your host. This week we got episode 352 entitled Avoiding the Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy. Yes, we're continuing our study of the logical fallacies. I believe after this week we only have two more, and then we're going to get back to doing some very strong biblical exegesis on the topics of Jesus' humanity and the one God. But I really wanted to make sure that we covered this particular fallacy because you might not recognize it by its name, but I'm pretty sure that you have seen people commit this particular logical fallacy. So as I mentioned, we're going to examine this week the Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy. And this fallacy occurs when somebody emphasizes similarities in data while ignoring the differences. And they do this in order to falsely claim a pattern or some sort of significance. And the particular issue of this fallacy is that the person who commits it basically cherry picks their data points in order to fit a desired conclusion rather than objectively analyzing the full set of data, information, or verses. Confirmation bias plays a significant role in the Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy because people often seek out and give greater weight to evidence that supports their pre-existing beliefs, while at the same time, confirmation bias allows us to ignore or downplay evidence that contradicts our pre-existing conceptions. And so the Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy is a manifestation of this particular bias because it involves shaping the data to fit a preferred narrative, ideology, or preconceived theological position. So what are some examples of the Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy? Why is this particular logical fallacy unhelpful in our dialogues about the oneness of God and Jesus' humanity? And how should we, in turn, debate and discuss theology without falling prey to the Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy? Let's find out on this week's episode of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast. Our first point today is defining the Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy. If you know me, you know that we're always going to define our terms before we move into our exegesis. So, as I already mentioned, the Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy is the logical fallacy that involves focusing on patterns or data that supports a particular conclusion, while at the same time, and this is the key point, ignoring all the data that contradicts it. It gets its name from the idea of a sharpshooter that's firing bullets at the side of a barn and then going afterwards and painting a target around those new bullet holes in order to make it appear as if the shots were originally aimed precisely at the pre-existing bullseye. Now, the person who commits this logical fallacy is selecting only the pieces of data or the verses that support their desired conclusion, while at the same time ignoring or downplaying data or verses that don't fit their conclusion. And by doing this, they are artificially creating the illusion of accuracy or a trend. And this often involves the human tendency that we all have, which is to seek and to find patterns, even in random or unrelated data. But the fallacy maker is going to impose order or significance onto the data that in reality might just be coincidental or, in fact, random. And the fallacy is really a good example of what is called post hoc reasoning. And this occurs when a person draws a conclusion after the fact based on a selective choosing of the evidence. The person who commits this fallacy is looking for a set of results based on some sort of outcome that they deem to be favorable, and then they claim that there's some sort of meaningful connection or pattern. But the key issue is that in doing so, they are ignoring all of the verses, all of the evidence, and all of the data that contradicts their particular view. So let's talk about some common examples of the Texas Sharpshooter fallacy in our modern culture. So let's just look at medical studies. There are a lot of people that claim to be medical experts in the last 4 years. So I want you to suppose that a pharmaceutical company is testing a new drug, and in doing so, they collect a wide variety of data about its effects on multiple health conditions. Now, if the company only focuses on the few conditions where the drug seems to have actually worked, and at the same time ignoring all the conditions where it showed no effect or the unfortunate negative side effects, then this pharmaceutical company is committing the Texas Sharpshooter fallacy. They are cherry-picking only the successful data, and in doing so, they are wrongly, illegitimately, and falsely suggesting that the drug is broadly effective. See what they do? They only pick out the evidence that supports the conclusion that they want, but in doing so, they are ignoring a vast amount of evidence that contradicts their conclusion. What about with horoscopes or the study of astrology, which should not be confused with astronomy? Now, people often will read horoscopes in the newspaper, and they feel that these horoscopes are actually accurate. However, this is pretty much a result of the Texas Sharpshooter fallacy, because people focus on the horoscope predictions, especially those that seem to match their life experiences, while ignoring the vague or the inaccurate predictions. And in this way, they impose a false pattern on general statements while overlooking the evidence that contradicts the conclusion that they have just recently drawn. What about the stock market? Well, a person might claim that they can actually predict stock market trends by pointing to a few instances where their predictions were actually correct. But in doing so, they are ignoring or overlooking the many times that their predictions were actually wrong. And by only highlighting the few successful predictions, they falsely create the appearance of a pattern or an ability to successfully predict the stock market. Now, why is the Texas Sharpshooter fallacy fallacious? Well, for one, we are actually misrepresenting reality. When we selectively choose a little bit of evidence, and in doing so we ignore all of the evidence that contradicts the conclusion that we just drew with our selective choosing of the evidence, then we are presenting an incomplete and a skewed version of the data by ignoring the important data that could change or actually invalidate the conclusion that we just drew. The second reason is that it involves faulty reasoning. The conclusions that we draw from cherry-picking a couple of verses are actually unreliable conclusions because they don't reflect the full scope of the scriptural data and the evidence that's actually available. And the third reason why it's fallacious is that it is logically inconsistent. The process of focusing on select favorable data actually undermines the logical consistency of the argument, resulting in misleading and erroneous conclusions. So, enough about the hypothetical. Let's move to the practical, which is point number 2, common Texas Sharpshooter fallacies in Christological debates. And I came up with 5 that I think are extremely common, and they are extremely fallacious, and we need to be able to recognize this fallacy and be aware of the tendency for these particular arguments to come up so that we can debunk them and we can call them out. We can say that they are fallacious arguments, and we can learn to argue more effectively if we ourselves are guilty of making these arguments. So, the first example is the selective use of Jesus being called God, using the Greek noun theos. Now, in my opinion, there are only 2 passages in the New Testament that actually call Jesus God. And that's John 20:28 and Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8. Now, I know in the context of both these passages, it's clear that Jesus actually has a God, like John 20:17, and of course Hebrews chapter 1, verse 9. Now, there are several other verses that are grammatically ambiguous that might call Jesus God, and they might call the Father God, and I'm thinking of passages like Titus 2:13 or 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. But as far as clear passages that seem to unambiguously call Jesus Theos, we only have 2. John 20:28 and Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8. Now, some people make the argument that these 2 references that call Jesus God should be given the full weight in defining one's Christology and, by extension, defining the doctrine of the Trinity. But in doing so, these apologists, these interpreters, are ignoring the 1,300 other places where the New Testament uses the word God to refer to the Father alone. Again, those stats are that Jesus is called God for sure twice, but the Father is called God over 1,300 times. So to latch on to 2 references while ignoring that 99.9% of the time, the reference of theos, o theos, in the Greek New Testament refers to the Father alone, and of course never to the triune God, is committing the Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy. So if God primarily means the Father alone, if they want it to be logically consistent, then saying that Jesus is God is actually to make the argument that Jesus is the Father. But Jesus is not God, because of course Jesus is not the Father. Jesus is the Son. But Jesus is, in fact, God's agent. And God naturally shares his titles with his agents. Just like in the Old Testament, prophets can be called God, like Moses. Judges can be called God, like in the book of Exodus. And the Israelite king is called God in Psalm 45:6 and Isaiah 9:6. So, of course, Jesus, being the ultimate messianic king, can be called God. As we see in the New Testament, there seems to be 2 references to where that takes place. But Jesus is God only in the sense that he represents the only true God, whom Jesus describes as the Father alone in John chapter 17, verse 3. So, the second example that we'll look at is cherry-picking isolated quotes from the Church Fathers. And Trinitarian apologists are extremely guilty of doing this. What they regularly do is that they find an isolated passage from the early Church Fathers, a particular passage that will ascribe the title God to Jesus, and these apologists will conclude, based on these isolated passages, therefore, that these early Church Fathers must have believed in the full divinity of Jesus, despite the fact that the Council of Chalcedon had not yet taken place. Chalcedon was in the middle of the 5th century, in 451. But what almost inevitably occurs in the lifting of a passage out of its context is that these apologists ignore how the church father in question is not actually a Chalcedonian Christian. He doesn't actually argue that Jesus is 100% God and 100% man, born at a due time. But instead, this church father is almost certainly what is called a logos theologian. A logos theologian is an early Christian who ascribes to the logos a middle Platonic understanding of divinity. while these church fathers also identify the true God as the Father alone. So they'll describe the true God as the Father, but then they'll describe the Logos or the Son also as God, not as the true God, but as a lesser subordinate being. And in doing so, they're actually Logos theologians. They are subordinate Christologists, but they are interpreting the data in light of Middle Platonism. So just because a passage is going to describe Jesus as God doesn't mean that the church father believed that Jesus was fully divine. So you have to look at all of the evidence, and almost certainly the apologists who make these arguments have not taken the time to read the church fathers in their original languages and to draw conclusions based on a full reading of the passage. That's why reading the church fathers is difficult. It's difficult work because you can't just grab a couple of verses here. You have to read what the author says in all of his work. The third point, looking at the plural us text in the Old Testament in order to argue that God is not really one person, but that God is instead a plurality of persons, perhaps a triune God. So we have four of the us texts that are ascribed to God in the Old Testament. We have Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, let us make man in our image. We have Genesis chapter 3, verse 22, after Adam and Eve ate of the forbidden fruit, and God says that humanity has become like one of us. And then in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 8, where Isaiah saw Yahweh in the throne room, and there are a variety of seraphs in the area, and God says, who will go for us? And so it's very common for people to grab a handful of these, but it's almost always Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Let us make man in our image. And they will argue that God, who is being described here with a plural pronoun, cannot possibly be one person, thereby undermining the Unitarian claim. They're going to say that God must be a plurality of persons, and they'll conclude from that that God must be the triune God. But this is a very common example of the Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy, because these interpreters are ignoring the 20,000 singular references to the one God that occur throughout the Bible. And by 20,000 singular references, I'm referring to singular pronouns, singular verbs, singular adjectives, and singular pronominal suffixes that all point to the one true God, Yahweh, as only one person. And there are better explanations for these plural texts, whether they be God talking to angels, as we can clearly see in Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 8, or to the plural of majesty, as arguably is what is taking place in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. So by drawing on a handful of us texts, while at the same time ignoring over 20,000 times that God is described as a single person, is a massive, fallacious account that's actually being committed. Our fourth example is pointing to Jesus, who seems to be performing and doing the things that only God is supposed to do. So some interpreters and apologists will note that Jesus forgives sins, walks on water, and actually raises the dead. These are things that only God can do. And so they conclude that if Jesus is doing all these God things, then he must be God in the flesh. He must be God having come down to earth and taken the form of humanity because he's doing these God things. But this, of course, is an example of the Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy. It ignores the massive amount of evidence where Jesus is described as the one who has been sent, which means that Jesus is God's agent. And as an agent, Jesus is empowered by God to share in God's attributes and also in God's prerogatives. In the Synoptic Gospels in particular, Jesus performs these as the Son of Man from Daniel chapter 7. And in Daniel chapter 7, verse 14, it says, to him, to the Son of Man, was given by the Ancient of Days dominion, glory, and a kingdom, meaning that God has shared with the Son of Man God's own dominion, God's own glory, and God's own kingdom. It also ignores the passages in the Old Testament to where God shares his attributes and his prerogatives and his roles with the human king, particularly Psalm 8, Psalm 45, Psalm 72, and Psalm 89. These psalms clearly indicate that Yahweh has empowered a human being, a human king in particular, with God's own prerogatives. And Jesus, being the Messiah, of course, is the ultimate human king. So just because Jesus is doing God things doesn't mean that Jesus and God have now collapsed into a single being. It means that Jesus is God's highly empowered agent, while Jesus remains 100% human. And the fifth example of the fallacy being committed is in arguing for Jesus' literal preexistence in the pages of the Old Testament. So there aren't any clear passages in the Old Testament that talk about the preexistence of the Son. They just aren't there. So those that want to make the argument have to find these obscure, indirect, and unclear passages and squint really hard and strongly make some sort of argument to suggest that that's actually Jesus present there in the pages of the Old Testament as a conscious being. For example, Genesis chapter 18 and 19, where the three men appear to Abraham and eventually they are called angels. Or the appearance of the angel of the Lord to Moses in a passage like Exodus chapter 3 in the burning bush episode. These passages are commonly looked at and assumed to refer to the preexistence of the Son, Jesus, before he was born, Jesus consciously existing prior to his birth. Now, despite the fact that these passages don't use the word Son, don't use the word Jesus, and clearly indicate that the person present is actually an angel that is a heavenly angelic being, the arguments fail to take into account the several passages in the New Testament where Jesus is created in the womb of his mother. He is brought into existence. And if Jesus began to exist in the womb of his mother, as we can clearly see in Matthew chapter 1:18, Matthew chapter 1 verse 20, Luke 1:35, then Jesus could not have existed one moment prior to coming into existence, meaning Jesus could not have existed in the pages of the Old Testament, especially in these passages like Genesis chapter 18 and 19 and Exodus chapter 3, which don't refer or mention Jesus or pre-existing Son at all. And of course, Jesus as the human Messiah is not an angel. He's not a heavenly angelic being. So those that make the argument that Jesus actually is there in these Old Testament passages are selectively picking evidence that they think supports their view while ignoring the clear and plain and straightforward passages that indicate that Jesus was created in the womb of Mary, meaning Jesus was brought into existence. So, how can we avoid committing the Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy? This is our third and final point. And we're going to look at some really good examples to help us make sure that we are not making fallacious arguments. The first tip that I'm going to offer is that we need to consider all of the available textual evidence. So the most fundamental and basic way to avoid committing the Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy is to ensure that we are taking into consideration all of the passages rather than cherry-picking the evidence that supports our own desired conclusion while ignoring or hoping that nobody else draws attention to the passages that contradict the position that we are raising. So how do we do this? Well, you've got to look at the entire data set before you draw your conclusions. If you already have a preconceived idea of what the conclusion is, then you're likely to commit the confirmation bias when you look for examples. So you have to train yourself to not ignore evidence that contradicts your hypothesis, or even evidence that appears to be neutral. So make sure that we are taking a comprehensive approach to looking at the biblical data, not just a selective approach that only looks for evidence that supports the view that we're supposed to take. So if you're making a theological argument, don't just focus on the verses that support your view or your church's view or what your parents tell you. You also need to examine the verses that might challenge your view and understand how you can fit them into the bigger picture without ignoring them or acting as if they don't exist. The second tip I'm going to offer is that we need to establish clear criteria before examining the scriptural data. So before you analyze the biblical text, let's make sure that we set some clear rules and some objective criteria on what actually is going to count as evidence that's going to support the doctrine that we're trying to find support for. And by doing this, we are prevented from imposing a pattern after the fact. So in order to do this, make sure that we define what specific outcomes or results that we're looking for before we go looking at the text of the Bible. And we should decide in advance how we're going to evaluate this evidence and stick to that criteria consistently. So if we say we're only going to take seriously the clear and the straightforward passages, then we need to do that. If there are passages that seem to be vague, or they're poetic, or they're open to different textual decisions, as in they have different manuscript variations, or they're open to interpretation bias with different translations interpreting it in different ways, then we need to evaluate that evidence a little bit differently. We don't ignore it. We don't act like it doesn't exist, but we need to set it in a different category than texts that are clear, plain, and straightforward. The third tip is that we need to avoid any retrospective pattern recognition. So as I pointed out several times now, the Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy often arises when we look at the scriptural data retrospectively and we impose a pattern that may not actually be intended nor meaningful. So we got to be aware of the temptation as humans to find patterns, especially when there aren't any that are actually there. So how do we do this? Well, ask yourself the question, is this pattern that I'm seeing meaningful, or is it just a coincidence? And we should use proper statistical analysis to determine whether a pattern is real, or is it the result of random chance. In theological discussions, rather than focusing on isolated examples where a prophecy or a verse might seem to align with modern interpretations that you see on the news in CNN or in your newspaper, examine whether the pattern holds consistently across a wide body of text in their proper context. And the last example that we're going to give is that we need to look for counterexamples. So one effective way to avoid the fallacy is to actively, deliberately, and intentionally seek out contradictory data. Look for verses that actually disprove the position that you think is actually true. And this will help you to develop a much more balanced and nuanced understanding. It might bring you to conclude that instead of a particular doctrine being clearly taught, you could say, well, it's mostly taught, but some of the evidence is difficult to interpret, or it's complex, or it's a little messy. It's okay to admit that. It's not your fault. You're just being honest with the state of the evidence. So you should intentionally search for evidence that is going to contradict your hypothesis, because maybe your hypothesis is actually incorrect, and the evidence that you look for that contradicts it actually is pointing you in the right direction. The only way you can do that is to be honest about the passages that say something different than the conclusion that you've already previously assumed. So when you find this contradictory evidence, Incorporate it into your own reasoning. Draw your conclusions based on all of the evidence, not just the handful of passages that you think support your view. You got to be able to make a theological position that takes into account all of the data, not just some of the data, while ignoring lots of other data. If you believe that certain Bible verses clearly indicate that Jesus is fully divine, you also need to take into account verses where Jesus is clearly described as a human being, where Jesus speaks of his dependence on the Father, where Jesus says the Father is greater than he is, where Jesus is brought into existence, where Jesus says the Father is the only true God. And you have to take into account and draw a conclusion based on all of these passages and fit that into your understanding. And if we follow these 4 tips, we too can avoid falling prey to the Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Join us next week as we examine another common logical fallacy, the composition/division fallacy. What is the composition-division fallacy? Please look forward to our next episode, and I'll tell you all about it. If you enjoy our podcast, please consider supporting us as we aim to promote the sound truths about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. You may support us absolutely free by simply subscribing online in whatever way that you are listening to this right now. You can also give an honest review on iTunes or in the comments section on YouTube. That doesn't cost you anything. And of course, you can freely share your favorite episodes with your friends. If you'd like to throw a few dollars our way, you can offer a donation by checking out the episode's description for a link to PayPal, or you can subscribe with a monthly subscription on the YouTube channel. The Biblical Unitarian Podcast is produced and edited by Dustin Williams. I am Dustin Smith, your host. Until next time, please take care.